Many parents notice a quiet shift at some point in their child's adulthood. There is no argument, no defining conversation, no clear moment that marks the change. Just a gradual realization. Their adult child no longer needs them in the same way. Decisions are made independently. Problems are handled without consultation. Details of daily life are shared less often, and usually after the fact. Not because something has gone wrong, but because something has changed. For many parents, this transition feels more unsettling than expected. Even when they understand that independence is a natural part of adulthood, the emotional experience does not always align with that understanding. There is a quiet sense of displacement. The relationship has not ended, but it no longer holds the same structure. And over time, the focus shifts. It is no longer only about the child. It becomes a question about the parent. Who are you when the person who once needed you no longer does? Most parents enter this stage with a certain expectation. They assume that as their child becomes independent, life will feel lighter. There will be more time, fewer responsibilities, and a sense of completion after years of involvement. This expectation is reasonable. Independence suggests that the child is capable and able to function without constant guidance. But the emotional reality is often more complex. Instead of relief, many parents experience an unfamiliar kind of emptiness. The structure that once organized daily life becomes less defined. Moments that were previously filled with interaction or responsibility begin to open up. This space is not always experienced as freedom. It can feel like a loss of direction. There is less urgency, fewer immediate demands, and less confirmation of one's role. What often goes unspoken is that this stage is not simply a reduction of responsibility. It is a reconfiguration of identity. Over time, parenting extends beyond a functional role and becomes part of how a person understands themselves. For many years, daily life is structured around the child's needs. Decisions are influenced by their well-being. Attention is directed toward their development, their challenges, and their future. Gradually, this level of involvement shapes identity. Being a parent is no longer something one does. It becomes something one is. The role provides purpose, direction, and a consistent sense of relevance. There is always something to respond to, something to manage, something to support. Because this structure develops slowly, it often feels natural rather than constructed. There is no clear point at which the role becomes central. It simply becomes the framework of daily life. When the child's need for that structure decreases, the shift is not limited to the relationship. It affects the internal sense of who the parent is. What once felt stable begins to feel less certain, not because something has failed, but because the conditions that sustained that identity have changed. When parents describe this stage, they often focus on what appears to be missing: less communication, less involvement, less visibility into the child's life. But what is changing is not only connection, it is function. For many years, the parent occupied a clearly defined position. They were needed, consulted, and relied upon. Their presence had a direct and ongoing impact. That role provided structure. It created continuity between days, decisions, and interactions. As the child becomes independent, that structure loosens. The parent is no longer at the center of the child's decision-making. Their input is not required in the same way. Their involvement becomes intermittent. This can create the impression that something essential has been lost. In reality, the position within the relationship has changed. The role remains, but it no longer organizes the relationship in the same way. And when a role that once provided meaning becomes less central, the absence is felt internally as well. The discomfort that arises during this transition is not explained only by the change in the relationship. It is also shaped by the loss of a familiar internal structure. For years, attention, time, and emotional energy were directed toward a clear purpose. There were ongoing signals that reinforced that role: requests for help, shared decisions, visible dependence. These signals created a steady feedback loop. They confirmed that the parent was needed. When those signals become less frequent, that system quiets. There are fewer external indicators of relevance, fewer moments that clearly define one's place within the relationship. This does not mean the relationship has weakened. It means the parent is no longer receiving the same continuous reinforcement of their role. In the absence of that structure, uncertainty can emerge, not about the child, but about oneself. Beneath this transition, there is often a quieter concern that is not easily articulated. It is not only the change in the relationship that feels difficult, it is the question that follows it. If the role that once defined a large part of life becomes less central, what replaces it? This question is rarely experienced directly. It appears as unease. Moments that were once structured now feel open. Time that was once directed now requires new decisions. The absence of constant involvement creates space, but that space is not immediately comfortable. The role of being needed provided a stable reference point. It clarified priorities and gave daily life continuity. Without that reference, identity can feel less anchored. This does not mean something is wrong. It means a familiar structure is no longer organizing experience in the same way. When this uncertainty appears, many parents respond in ways that are understandable and automatic. They attempt to restore the previous sense of connection. Contact may become more frequent. Advice may be offered more readily. There may be a stronger effort to remain involved in decisions, even when that involvement is no longer necessary. These responses are not driven by a desire for control. They are attempts to return to a role that once felt stable. The parent is not trying to interfere. They are trying to reestablish a familiar position. From the perspective of the adult child, these efforts can feel different. What was once experienced as support may be perceived as pressure. What was once guidance may feel like oversight. The dynamic shifts further. The more the parent moves toward involvement, the more the adult child moves toward distance. Both are responding to the same change, but in opposite directions. At a certain point, the adjustment required is not only relational, it is internal. The relationship with the adult child is changing, but so is the structure of the parent's own life. For many years, meaning was closely tied to a role that required constant engagement. As that role becomes less central, meaning cannot depend on the same source. This does not require withdrawing from the relationship. It requires redistributing attention. Interests, routines, and forms of engagement that were secondary begin to take on greater importance. The parent is no longer organized primarily around the child. They begin to reorganize around their own life. This shift is gradual. It does not happen through a single decision. Over time, identity expands beyond one role. The relationship with the adult child remains, but it becomes one part of a broader structure rather than the central one. Within that structure, stability returns in a different form. The transition from being needed to being less central is one of the more complex adjustments in family life. Not because the relationship ends, but because its foundation changes. For many years, closeness was organized around guidance, involvement, and dependence. As children become adults, that structure gives way to something less defined, but not less meaningful. What replaces it is a relationship between two separate individuals. When identity has been closely tied to being needed, this shift can feel like loss. But it also allows for a different kind of connection, one not sustained by constant involvement, but by choice. Over time, as both sides adjust, the relationship becomes quieter and more stable. Less central, but more balanced. Not defined by necessity, but by a willingness to remain connected within new boundaries.